you everyone for coming, and thank you to the CHF for having us. So the way the conversation will more or less be structured, this may be familiar to many of you, we'll have a discussion between us in which I pose a number of questions to Mohammed for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor to everyone else for the remainder of the hour, so you can also ask him your questions and so on. My questions for Mohammed really stem from his work, his recent work, on what he's calling the Lifeworlds of Islam, a manuscript that he's currently working on, which really tries to understand what Islam looks like from a particular approach. And that's actually how I want to start the conversation, to ask him about that approach. So when we think about the festival's tagline this year is belief. When we think about belief, we often think about certain kinds of questions, right? They tend to be theological questions, perhaps in some cases questions about history, but usually theological, metaphysical, ethical questions. Those are the types of things that we think about when we think about what it means to believe and what belief means in people's lives. But Muhammad is actually approaching the question of belief and the question of Islam more narrowly from what is a sociological approach, right? So he's trained as a sociologist, writing within a discipline called sociology. And so the first question that I wanted to ask Mohammed about is, what do you think a sociological approach does for your work? What does it allow us to understand? What does it contribute to the conversation that perhaps some of these other ways of thinking about belief may not?
Okay, thank you, Junaid. I'm happy to be here. I want to, first of all, to say that my interest in the sociological approach does not mean that it is the only viable approach to study anything, but it allows us to kind of look at one part of reality that we often ignore. And for me, what I was interested in is not the question of what Islam is, but what Muslims do as people. And for me, that for me was the more primary question, because ideas, including religious ideas, beliefs, and so on, are things that thinking humans bring into our world. And ideas don't establish themselves by themselves; they establish themselves by someone arguing on their behalf. And I think focusing on people, furthermore, allows us better to understand the variety of the Islamic experience. Because ultimately we're talking about a religion that is deep in time and broad in space. It is 1400 years old. It exists in virtually every continent. It includes among the believers people who are very different from each other, people who speak different languages, people who belong to different ethnicities, people who are rich, those who are poor, some are working class, others are farmers. They have very different lifestyles from each other. Yet they all believe the same thing, or so they see themselves as doing. But I wanted to see what that variety of life forms and social status kind of allow us to see when we look at the Islamic experience from the point of view of individuals who believe in Islam, rather than beginning from the Quran, for example, or from religious texts.
So this, I think, leads us kind of very, very seamlessly into the title of the panel or today's event, and also your current work, right? What you call the life world of Islam. So I think here again we have a notion of what it means to center experience, center the individual, center the individual believer rather than belief, right? The individual thinker rather than ideas. But I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about what that kind of concept of life worlds means within the context of your work, and again, what does it allow us to understand?
Okay. This can very quickly become philosophical and difficult. Life world as a term was first proposed by German phenomenological philosophers. I use it in a simplified form in this work because what I want to say, and this is something that I argue in the introduction, is that anything that is expected to be eternal, like a religion, for example, right, or a religious idea, right, and does kind of persist century after century, right, then one of the things that we ask about, or should think about when we think about its kind of future prospects and also historical trajectory is, how did it survive? How does an idea that is old kind of be reinvented so that it is useful again in modern times or even postmodern times? Right? How do old ideas persist? And that is part of my larger kind of study of traditions, really, how traditions actually persist even when times change. So the way by which the old kind of survives into the new period, that's what I call the life world. Right? This is kind of the laboratories of faith. Examples of that are social movements. Right? So Islamic social movements, Islamic political parties, for example. There are opportunities by people to take an old idea, an old religion, and give it a new meaning in modern times. Something like public philosophy, the way kind of religion kind of is debated in public. Also, the way Islam is talked about in public, in Islamic publics today, is very different from the way it was talked about in the 19th century, for example. Right? So the way by which kind of the public philosophy of Islam, that is the public philosophy through which kind of the believers get to know what their faith is about, is something that is dynamic. Right? And that is what I mean by Lifeworlds. Lifeworlds, namely these laboratories of ideas, where actually they are given a new life, so to speak, to live on in changing times.
So I think, I think what becomes very clear is that you're really interested in these questions about how things continue and how they remain durable despite the changing times, and it becomes a very important question, especially in the last couple of 100 years at least. And so I do want to drill down a little bit and ask you about these different life roles that you're talking about. But before maybe we do that, maybe ask you to take a step back and think a little bit more about not just your project, but also the discipline of sociology or the discipline of Islamic studies, the way that Islam gets talked about in the academy, but also in a kind of larger public world, right? And a lot of what we hear about with respect to Islam tends to really focus on this kind of traumatic episode of 9/11. But you also point to a few other major events in the past half century, a few decades, which have really structured the way sociologists in particular, but I think academics more broadly, have really thought about Islam. And it's always sort of in relation to our relationship to Islam, right? So our being an American relationship to Islam. And you have in mind here, I think, the Iranian Revolution, most prominently. Perhaps you have other examples. And more recently, I think the Arab Spring, in which the world is transfixed, but America is certainly part of that world, which is very keen to find out what exactly is going to happen to this very long-standing, this region of the world that has kind of long-standing conflicts, long-standing questions that we're always sort of trying to figure out. So I wonder if you can sort of begin to sketch for us what that history looks like.
Okay, that's a lot of things. But one thing that these episodes have in common, right, is that they are surprising. The Iranian Revolution was surprising. No one expected it, right, when it happened. The Arab Spring was surprising. No one expected it either. Right? All kinds of attacks on time. Right? They catch you by surprise, and then you begin to pay attention. And being surprised, for me, is a fundamental kind of experience, because being surprised means that our old knowledge system was lacking something, and therefore a surprise and an opportunity to learn, right, from it. What do we learn from it? Well, we learn that the world is complicated, to put it simply, right? And also that people who actually change the world don't realize often what they are doing. For example, Ayatollah Khomeini, in 1971, just a few years before the Iranian Revolution, was saying it is going to take us 200 years to get rid of the Shah. He himself did not see what he was what he was about to do. The participants in the Arab uprising, likewise, at the day before the uprising, they thought that the systems under which they lived were going to be eternal, and nothing will change them. And the people. But in both cases, the Iran Revolution, the Arab Spring, modern Islamic movements as well, seem to point to one thing, which is the mobilization of a lot of people who previously were not political. For example, that's more recently in the Arab Spring, the vast majority of the participants were people who never voted in their life before. They never belonged to any political party. They never even went to a demonstration in their life before. They were all apolitical people. The vast number of the members of Islamic, mass-based Islamic movements, also for them, those movements were their first experience in politics. So one of the things about Islam that we learn, at least as a social, as the material for social movement, I understand, is that it offered a language that is familiar enough for a lot of people to express their grievances. And those tended to be the people who did not necessarily want an Islamic political system, for example. For example, there are many public opinion polls around the world which ask Muslims, do you want an Islamic state in your country, or do you want at least the government to be based on the Sharia? The majority say yes. But then when you get into the nitty-gritty, you ask them about specific laws, they never mention the Sharia. Right? And in fact, when you tell them that the Sharia says this or that, they say, oh, I didn't know that. So for most people, an Islamic political order, right, or governing based on the Sharia are simply code words for a non-corrupt system. But doesn't mean that they want Islamic theology to be in charge. And in fact, most people who had an experience with Islamic theology did not like it, ultimately. The experience was not good. In many situations where Islamic political parties joined the government, often they lost votes in the next cycle, right? Because they became political actors like any other. Right? So for me, the question was really, we have a region, part of the world we call the Muslim world. It is large and complicated. It is full of problems, social, political, economic, cultural, and we have a vast experience where the vast majority of the Muslim world throughout the 20th century was governed by a secular elite, and that's still the case. Most Muslim societies, the cultural elite tend to be secular, and often that is the case as well until now. So you have movements, ultimately, but in the sense that the political order itself at the top is frozen and something needs to be done about that. And the Islamic movements, as we know them, to me at least, seem to be just experiments. New experiments in expressing protest, in expressing grievances, in calling for a non-corrupt kind of political order, right? Using whatever language the ordinary people happen to be familiar with. Right? In this case, Islam. And we have to keep in mind that actually in most of the Muslim world, right, Islamic social movements were small for most of their history. That includes Pakistan. Which now looks very Islamic, right, in terms of its politics, but it was founded by a secular elite, right, that did not want a theocracy, that wanted simply a state for the Muslims of India, right, but not an Islamic state. Right. And gradually that begins to change.
So I think, this is because a lot of your work has tended, a lot of this project anyways, I think not true of all of your work, because some of your earlier stuff is really about early Islam. And so this gives you a certain kind of vision as to the kind of historical unfolding, if you will, of Muslims, as you say. Maybe you don't want to speak in terms of kind of Islam as a capital I, one single entity. But this recent work is really focusing on Islamic movements, kind of modern instantiations of this public philosophy, but you do also frame it within a historical perspective. And I think that is actually a really interesting part of the work. And speaking of surprise, right, thinking about one of the surprising things, I think to many it will be a surprise, is that the way you think about Islam is actually not as a kind of singular, unique entity, right? So your kind of idea of what Islam or historical Islam looks like is actually as a very predictable kind of world system. And you have kind of certain kinds of ideas about what a world system needs to do in order to endure the way you've talked about. So what is it about these world systems? How does Islam fit into other world systems? And what is characteristic of these world systems that allow them to endure? What are the sorts of characteristics that they have?
This is a different part of my work, but does link to that. I have an interest in globalization generally, right? And the history from a historical perspective, because the world as we have it right now seems to be divided into nation states, but it has been linked before this era in various ways. So what we call globalization as a system of human networking, so to speak, right, is something that is old. Right? So I was looking, for example, at the history of monotheism, right, as one of those experiments that kind of tries to kind of give global connections some kind of cultural form, right, and give different people the sense of being, so to speak, a part of the same culture in spite of the difference in geography, difference in language, and so on. So, for example, Ibn Battuta, the famous Muslim traveler in the 14th century, was born in Tangier, which is in today's Morocco, traveled across North, West, East Africa, some of Iberia, the entire Middle East, India, Maldives, China, all that. Spent 25 years doing it. In that vast world, he always felt like a citizen of all that world. Why? Because he was a Muslim. That is how he saw himself. And being a Muslim meant that you can leave your hometown, travel 5,000 miles, or in this case, 8,000 miles perhaps, go to Delhi in India, work as a judge for 8 years without any further training. You don't have to go to school again. So the training that you need to function in that entire world was similar, so to speak, as far as the education systems are concerned. The other thing that Ibn Battuta felt that he could do was that because that whole world was his world, he could argue with people about what being a proper Muslim is. He goes to hammam, at the public bath in Lower Egypt, and he sees that people are naked. And he says to them, well, why are you naked? This is not Islamic. And they say to him, okay, how long are you staying here? Because that's how we do it here. He doesn't win the argument, obviously. In Maldives, he has the same argument with people, ultimately. So one thing about kind of claiming to be a Muslim in something that you call the Muslim world is you have a sense of global citizenship. That is based on common educational expectations, but also it gives you the right to argue. That is what citizenship also means, that you can argue with people and tell them what they should do. And of course, they likewise, they communicate back to you and respond and agree or disagree, so to speak. So much of the Muslim world, they understand it as part of this globally connected system, is that it does not really give it a coherence, necessarily. It does not give it uniformity, but gives everyone in it the sense that they are part of a world that they share, and they are equal citizens across that entire world, and therefore are able to make arguments. So historical Islam as a global social system, functioned that way, as a communicative system. No one was in control of it, ultimately. You don't have any, you do not have, with the term Muslim world, never really meant that there was a Muslim empire that ran that entire world. No one was really in control of the whole thing. The cultural elites were not in control of it either. They were divided across various kind of schools and madhab and so on and so forth. And that combination, this systematicity, this connectiveness, at the same time, the lack of control by any kind of authority over it, gave historical Islam the kind of dynamism and communicative nature, so to speak, that kind of that people themselves individually could participate in making before without necessarily waiting for someone to define what Islam is for them. So
I mean, so this is a kind of very interesting telling of what historical Islam looks like. But I think it's also fair to say that at some point this is sort of disrupted in some meaningful way. And often scholars point to the colonial experience in particular and the rise of the nation state, which fragments this kind of ability to move freely, for example, the kind of ability to have a diversity and yet some sort of unity, which is characteristic of a historical Islamic experience, a different sort of sense of identification, a different sense of belonging. I'd ask you to think, to tell us a little bit also about what the colonial experience does to this historical experience of what it meant to be a Muslim.
I can go on for hours on this. I tell my students that the world we have today is a colonial world, right? The world we have. It was created by colonialism, including the United States, which was created by settler colonialism in a different era. Right? And like everywhere else, almost the entire Muslim world became colonized, especially after World War I in particular, with few exceptions. But essentially the Muslim world as we have it today was a product of the colonial experience, almost all of it. Right? Now, what did that experience do? Right? There were two responses in the Muslim world to Western colonialism. One response was to say that colonialism is bad and it is an evidence of how evil the West is and so on. The anti-colonial kind of rhetoric. Then you have another response which actually connects more to modern Islam. Right? Which said, well, the problem actually of colonialism is us. Colonialism happened because we were weak. And it happened because our societies had degenerated or something like that. So don't blame the West. The West is doing what any power that has the power will do, which is to take over someone who is weaker. Right? And therefore the response is cultural rejuvenation, reinvention of society. Right? And these two kind of ways of thinking, that gives you two different types of movement. There's like the modernizing, westernizing, anti-colonial, secular elite, and you have the traditionalists, so-called traditionalists, who think that kind of renewal comes from within, that colonialism has happened because of our own internal weaknesses. And I'm simplifying because these were not these two kind of ways of thinking overlapped kind of a little bit. But colonialism gave us both, namely the secular response to colonialism and also the more traditional kind of response to colonialism. So one response that wanted to kick the West out, and the other wanted to simply use the colonial experience as an argument to reawaken a traditional, what was claimed to be traditional, forgotten kind of sources of strength and rejuvenation, as the early Muslim kind of modernizers thought.
And so you talk very directly about what this kind of public thinking, public philosophy, you call it, looks like in the wake of this experience. And you sort of distinguish between, so this is one way to distinguish the different responses, but another way is to think about what Islam means in this context, right? And you talk about them as a way to try to come to terms with this by drawing on one's Islamic heritage, Islamic text, Islamic culture, and you talk about them also in two responses. One is an instrumental response, and one is a kind of what you call a hermeneutic response. An attempt to try to make sense of this new situation. And this is something that is the kind of two very clear strains in public philosophical thinking as people come to grips with this new situation. I wonder if you can say more about these two different approaches.
Yeah, and again, I'm simplifying here, but within kind of modern Islamic public philosophy, you have these two major kinds of ways of thinking: the instrumental and the hermeneutic. Instrumental means that you use religion as an instrument to solve problems. And you do that by saying Islam is the solution. which is what the Muslim Brotherhood used to say in Egypt and elsewhere. Solution to what? It was never explained. But the slogan was generic, and general, and it was meant to be that way. Just like Make America Great Again. What does that mean, right? It is left vague, and you interpreted that as an audience, and you fill in, basically, the meaning. Right? And the idea of Islam as a solution functions in a similar way. Namely that we have political, economic inequalities, colonialism, occupation, all that. Islam is a solution to everything. But that gives religion a new role, right, which is as an instrument to solve problems that previously, right, people were trying to solve from a non-religious perspective. The other trend is what I call the hermeneutic, right, which does not really think about Islam or religion as a vehicle to solve problems, right, but rather as as something that has a philosophical substance that we need to communicate with. Right? And the idea is that anything, right, that is connected to God, right, is necessarily kind of unclear, right, to us, because God has infinite wisdom and we are humans with finite reason and lifespan. Right? So how could that which is finite kind of understand that which is infinite, let's speak of. And so the idea out of the hermeneutic perspective was that God perhaps communicates to every society and time period in a language that it can understand, but not necessarily the truth. It is what happens to be acceptable as truth for the time being. And these two ways of thinking, namely use Islam basically as a vehicle to solve problems in an instrumental kind of way, was led to politics, clearly, right, because the program was political. Right? The other, the more hermeneutic variety, remained as a philosophical movement, right? And the idea was to distinguish between to an original, essential, a true Islam, which is distant from us, so to speak, and is connected more to the intentions of God, which are always kind of not perfectly clear to human. And then we have modern, contemporary moment in which we live, in a specific time and space, that we can propose a solution, perhaps kind of based on religious reason, but we can never be sure that it is true.
So, I mean, you brought up now the Muslim Brotherhood, and this is sort of, in some ways, a stand-in for a lot of political Islam movements or Islamist movements, which is something you capture under the category of social movements, I guess, right? And one of the things you point out, which is very interesting, and I think is not something that is often talked about, is to think about these movements as emerging. You've already sort of alluded to this. Think about these movements as emerging from within a particular context, right? And from within that particular context, they get when you paint that history for us, you really focus in on some key themes that make them popular, that allow them to capture the imagination of young people in particular, right? So participation in governments, kind of a care or a consciousness of different classes, about poor people in particular, a kind of renewed or perhaps new emphasis on social activism. So can you tell us a little bit more, like reiterate for us, maybe this may be a history that some people are familiar with, but really doesn't really penetrate into a lot of very current debates about what these Islamist movements look like. So I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about that history, where they emerged from.
They have different origins. The one that is kind of most common is like a Muslim Brotherhood type of organization. Even though we hear a lot about other types of movements, the noisier movements that we hear about who attack here and there tend to be numerically much smaller, and still are. and they're not kind of widely based social movements. The social movements that are widely based, that have millions of members or supporters, they tend to be kind of structured like the Muslim Brotherhood, which is basically a movement that officially begins in Egypt in 1928, but the exact moment can be debated really, right? And then spreads worldwide and becomes kind of, and we have branches of Muslim Brotherhood in dozens of countries at this point. The fundamental point of the Muslim Brotherhood was what I mentioned earlier, namely as a vehicle for cultural, social renewal, as the Muslim Brotherhood did. Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, thought that Islam was no longer being taught to the people in the traditional settings, so not in the mosque. And he thought that the mosque was the last place to go to learn anything about Islam. Why? Well, because the mosque at that point, in the early 20th century, Egypt under British colonialism was not doing anything useful from al-Banna's point of view. It was telling people only about rituals, how to pray, how to do proper hygiene, stuff like that, which al-Banna saw that was really not important to most people. Most people had problems with poverty, right? They had problems with foreign domination, they had problems with inequality, had problems with not having access to the political system. And so he started teaching Islam in cafes, in clubs, in the university, and moved outside of the mosque. And the Muslim Brotherhood was born that way, outside of the mosque, outside of the traditional kind of Islamic kind of educational systems, in modern environments. The majority of the members of the Brotherhood in its early years came from first generation migrants to the city from rural areas. So people who were uprooted from the earlier traditions and were looking for a new home, right, so to speak, to go to. They took care of people. So I think that the Muslim Brotherhood, the first thing it did every time it established itself in a new environment is to do a community project, build a mosque, for example, of a new type, or a school, or a clinic, or something like that. And politics came later, ultimately. But the idea of that type of organization was that you engage with the world in which you live, and you try to improve it without necessarily waiting for the government to do it, and also without waiting for you to take over the government. And that is how the Muslim Brotherhood kind of allows a lot of people, right, who are ordinary people, to actually feel that they are doing something useful in the world. That they are building a clinic, for example, in their neighborhood, or helping their neighbors. That was a form of participation. I was seeing that. To be distinct, of course, from democratic participation. And therefore, you had those types of Islamic organization gave their members something like, say, the liberal parties or the left-leaning parties or the Marxists could not do. Because those modern political parties, their approach to social change was that, well, we take over, we run election and we win, and we take over the government, or we overthrow it somehow, right? And then we change society from above, right? But if that didn't happen, then there was nothing for you to do as, say, a liberal or a nationalist or leftist kind of leaning political thinker. Right? You just became depressed and waited until the world changed. The advantage of the Islamic movements is that they did not do that. Their members did not need to feel depressed, so to speak. They could immediately engage with their neighborhoods and feel that they are useful individuals. And they do not need for the government to do it for the government to change. And they do not need necessarily to take it over, although they could have a political program on the side as well. That was not absent, right? But until you had a venue for political participation, you had other venues with which you could work.
So I think you really mean, when you use the word movement, that's a very deliberate choice, right? You think of these as sort of very dynamic organizations, and that dynamism is actually enabled by their distance from perhaps the kind of obsession with political power, with top-down political power on the one hand, and also a distance from the religious establishment, right? So when we think about, when we compare, for example, what you earlier sketched out as a historical Islam, by this period, especially in places like Egypt and other Arab countries in particular, you have a kind of vision of Islam that has been really closely allied with the state, or perhaps even co-opted by the state in some formulations. So when you talk about them as movements, you actually mean that they're movements, right? They're constantly changing, and I think one of the interesting things that you point out is that in that constant change, they often become somewhat unpredictable, or rather, they respond to these, changing contexts in which they find themselves in unpredictable ways. In some ways, they're very political in that sense, right? They respond, they interact, they debate as well. So I wonder if you can say something about that, especially in reference to this, there's this constant question in American minds in particular about what will happen to Muslim majority states when Islamists take over, right? And this is always the kind of fear. And, that's something that really animates a lot of discussion. But one of the things that your writing tends to point out is that actually that's not always a very predictable, the kind of assumption that this takeover will indicate a sort of totalitarian takeover of the state is not always borne out by history.
I was in Egypt when the Egyptian revolution happened in 2011. Not by planning, actually. I didn't realize it. I was the best year of my life, right? Because you could see how movements actually move, right? You also saw the dynamism of the ordinary people, in the sense that the people who used a religious language to explain the reality the day before the revolution, when the revolution happened, they did not do that. They stopped talking about religion because they saw themselves doing the revolution directly. And in a way, right, one of the things that if you watch soccer, for example, or sports of any kind, sometimes when the member of the team kind of scores something, he thanks God. Even though he himself has done it, right? I could see that. But he thanks an external force for his own effort. And that is typical. In the revolutionary time, though, I saw that way of explaining things was not there any longer, at least for a moment. And then came back. Right? People saw themselves to be the agents, right, of their own destiny for the first time. And that seemed to actually provide us with kind of a sense of hidden, so to speak, potential in everyone, right, that is not visible, except in times of crisis like that. So I thought, because of that religiosity actually was one. It's not the only way, actually, to give kind of your actions some kind of source, right, so to speak, outside of yourself, right? But it works, basically, until something else happens, right? Like a revolution in the case of the Arab Spring, where you see that there are other factors that can lead to a kind of a dramatic outcome, including yourself as an individual. So social movements for me are dynamic things. They move. They are, if they are really movements, new people join, and those new people kind of give the movement their own reason, their own kind of language, their own justification, and so on. And these are experiments. Now, one thing that we know is that movements, Islamic movements, that reached government also lost legitimacy or popularity. Why? Because they govern. Anyone who governs becomes contaminated, right, ultimately, right? And no longer kind of appears to be as pure as he or she was before. And this is something also I hear in Egypt after the revolution. People voted for mercy. The Muslim Brotherhood candidate 1 year after they were all against him. Because, as one taxi driver told me, we thought that these people are بتوع ربنا, as he said, like these are God's people, and therefore they should govern. They are better than others. But of course, when you govern, you have to solve problems. And if you don't have the means for it, then you are going to lose. Especially if you replace the kinds of things that people are asking for, namely social services, namely corruption, and so on. If you replace a kind of delivery of those goods with symbolic language and cultural issues, which are kind of don't really solve anybody's problems, and then you have a kind of that problem. Hamas in Palestine, the same thing. Hamas in Palestine in 2006 won because it campaigned against corruption. It never mentioned the Israeli occupation in its campaign in 2006. It didn't mention anything about what it was known for. It focused its campaign entirely on combating corruption. And for that reason, it won. Now, once it won, of course, it lost popularity because of the same reason. It became a governing party that governs like any other parties and receives problems because of its contamination with the reality of governing. So a lot of those movements can afford to kind of appear to be idealistic, or they actually do appear to be so, as long as they are not contaminated with the stuff of governing, so to speak. And some of them, the wiser ones, actually stay away from governing and kind of focus on transforming society from below through activism in civil society or through other venues, but not necessarily through governing. But governing is attractive, especially Mara states, because Mara states are powerful states that have a lot at their disposal, and therefore they tend to encourage all kinds of political parties, religious or otherwise, to try to take them over.
Okay, so I have a lot of other questions, but I think it's a good time to open up for questions from the floor.
Could you please give us a hopefully very short explanation of the differences between Sunni and Shiite, both in their origins and in their current behavioral and action-oriented in today's world? And then whether or not it's really true, or is this just economic and political competition between Saudi Arabia and Iran?
Short. Right now, there is a struggle that is entirely political between Saudi Arabia and Iran. The struggle doesn't really make sense to me, frankly, but it does make a lot of sense to the power holders, especially in Saudi Arabia, as kind of a way, and has nothing to do with Sunnism or Shiism. It has to do with this modern struggle, in particular, a struggle between states, vying for power in a world region. And one of the ways by which they try to build alliances is by using the Sunni-Shia divide, which is, a lot of it is manufactured. For example, Iraq, when the Americans went to Iraq, they created a sectarian government that did not exist before. What the Americans knew at that point about Iraq before 2003, the only thing that anyone was told is that Iraq consists of Sunni, Shia, and Kurds. Now, Iraqis themselves don't see themselves necessarily that way. Why? Well, because the political parties that were historically strong in Iraq were mixed. The Iraqi Communist Party, for example, from the 40s, 50s, 60s, which was the largest party in the country then, bigger than the Ba'ath Party, had Sunni, Shia, Kurds, Jews, Yazidis, all kinds of sects in it. The Ba'ath Party of Saddam Hussein later. Originally, the majority of its leadership was Shia. But of course, it had a lot of Sunnis in it as well. So the modern Iraq in particular was not Sunni and Shia. It was, in fact, the forces that were really successful in the country were the ones that were mixed. Paul Bremer, who was put in charge of Iraq after the American invasion, was someone who was completely unfit, right, for the job. Right? And it's probably because of that reason he was chosen. Right? He could not identify a single neighborhood in Baghdad if you show it to him on the map. Right? He did not speak the language of the country. Right? Every time he met anyone in Iraq, the first question he would ask him, are you Sunni or Shia? Because that was the system that the Americans were imposing on Iraq at that point, a sectarian system that never existed before. Right? So a lot of the divisions, of course there are historical divisions between Shia and Sunnis, and we can spend a lot of time talking about them, but they were not all that consequential, right, for modern life. Right? And especially now, the struggle between Iran and Saudi Arabia is a struggle that is initiated by state actors, by governments. It is not started from below. It's not kind of being kind of created by social movements from below. Right? And I think I'll stop here because otherwise I'm going to take up the rest of the time. But I wanted to really highlight the fact that the historical origins of Sunnism and Shiism have nothing to do really with the kind of the political conflicts that we see in front of us today. Okay.
Thank you for the discussion. I just returned from a 3-week trip to Iran, and I must admit, skated on the surface of probably what is a very complicated country, but was very impressed by the people. I thought they were amazing, and they were not slaves to Shia Islam at all, at least from my observations. Although we have demonized them, and it's part of the historical evolution of peoples that they tend to demonize one religion for mostly political purposes. Could you address that, comment on that within the context of your work, to see if there is a way we can address that and educate people to avoid that?
Yeah, the best way I know is to get to know the people themselves as people, right? And as individuals. If we're not able to travel like you did, and meet them personally, right? There are things like the internet, which is kind of fabulous. You can connect with people that way. There's satellite television. Right? We have ways to know, right, other people. And I think no matter how much I speak, right, no matter how much we kind of talk about these kind of ideas, right, so to speak, they remain abstract until we know the people. And knowing the people does allow us to kind of make judgments. We have terror acts being done by Muslims, and terror acts being done by non-Muslims, like in Las Vegas. But when a non-Muslim does it, we say, well, this person is crazy as an individual, or has a personal problem, because we know that he is part of our society and we are not like that. Okay. Whereas we don't know that about Muslims, because we don't know Muslims. Right? So it is easy for a single act, right, by one person, right, to actually be identified with the entire kind of population, just because we know the population. We know ourselves, people who do acts of aggression, who come from within, or seem similar to us, we can easily dismiss them as not representing us. Yeah.
Next question.
In today's world, we don't call countries having a Christian majority population a Christian country. But countries having a Muslim majority tends to gravitate towards becoming an Islamic country where religion becomes the primary identity of the land. Do you think this assumption is true? And if it is, then do you think there's something inherent in the religion itself that causes this to happen?
The ruling party in Germany is called, anyone knows, Christian Democratic Party. Right? We have Christian Democratic parties throughout Europe, right? And they are often in power. Right? How did that happen? Christian democracy, right, in Europe is a movement that begins in the 19th century, right? Similar to modern Islam. Right? That is, you have the traditional conservative kind of segment of the population is trying to find a way to deal with new social problems, industrialization, urbanization, inequality, and so on, without using the language of secular socialism. They look for an alternative. Right? And so Christian democracy emerges out of that, and it continues to exist. Could we have a Muslim kind of social democracy? So I think actually a lot of the Islamic movements, right, the broad-based ones, that what they're trying to do is something similar to Europe, except that they never got to the advantage of the Christian Democratic parties that they were allowed to govern, right? And by governing, they moderated and changed and adjusted and learned over time. Right? The similar Islamic movements never had that experience, not yet, and were not allowed to do it, so to speak. So you don't have as much of a learning, historical learning. But if you look at things 100 years from now, you may have Islamic social democratic parties that look like the CDU in Germany. Right? I think it is unavoidable, though, right? Because in any society, you are going to have kind of a sort of a segment of the population that we tend to call conservatives, right? Although I think the term is not necessarily always accurate, that do want to have a voice, right, in the political scene, right? And sometimes they express that voice by linking them up to a religious foundation. Of course, there are other forces. There are the only forces there. But you cannot completely eliminate, right, the conservative kind of wing of the population if we want to have a viable democracy. Those have to be included. Right? The only thing, of course, that we want to guarantee is that they don't have monopoly over power, and that there is kind of an opportunity for experiential value that comes out of governing. Right? But so far we don't have that yet. Right?
You said early on that in events like the Arab Spring and the Iranian Revolution, that ordinary people who had not been active became politically active. And you also commented that there were some similarities in the appeal of Islam as the solution and Make America Great Again. There seemed to be in this country and in Europe quite similar movements, some surprises, and movements that I might call conservative, Make America Great Again, that would seem to have something in common with a movement toward Islamic states, as in going back to a time when we were something else. Well, first of all, is that a fair view of the world, and or of half the world, part of the world? And do you see this as a kind of zeitgeist that goes beyond Christian, Jew, Muslim, and I haven't even gotten into some of the other major players in the world, but is this something that's happening in more than just one segment? And is there something to take away from that or something to change that?
There are two things about this question that I think are very significant. One of them is that whenever we claim that we want to do something great again, usually we have to imagine something that we don't know, because we don't know what is being referred to. It is often a kind of appealing to imagine a glorious history when we live in what we regard to be a decadent present. And to say, well, there was a time when things were better. It could be 30 years ago. It could be 500 years ago. It does not have to be a period that we have empirically experienced ourselves. And we make up stories about. Even if it is a period that we personally know. Because we can say, well, America in the 50s, that is when it was great. For who? Obviously. For somebody, but not for others. So it's always a question of kind of orienting perspective so that we eliminate part of the story and so that things look like they have been great for everybody. Imagination is the way, is the name we give kind of this way of kind of constructing reality, but of course we're talking about the present. The other thing is that these movements, the populism is a shorthand for them, Hungary, US, and so on. One thing they have in common, just like the Trump campaign, although I don't want to talk about politics really, because of various reasons. But one thing that we know across all these movements is that they give ordinary people the sense of having a voice. That someone is speaking to them, even if that person or that political force does not care about them, but they don't see anyone else really speaking the kind of issues for the kinds of issues that they want. Some people blame that on globalization, say that global forces basically have kind of given people everywhere the sense that they are not in control of their own destiny. And now you have a counter movement where people want to imagine that they have some kind of control and some kind of say over their destiny. They may not necessarily like the result that they have right now, but the impulse is still there. That I want to be in control of my destiny, while living in a world that is big and vast and interconnected, and other people are making kind of decisions that affect my life without me having any say about it. We are still there, so that's the reality that we have right now. And if we continue to have that, we are going to have kind of political forces that try to kind of talk to that sentiment and mobilize it. So, and that can be quickly, ideology may be irrelevant. It's because we can move from extreme left to extreme right and so on, the same population, until it kind of identifies some kind of force, a political force or what have you, that genuinely and effectively kind of represent it. I don't see, and Islamic movements, as I described them, are really part of that process. They're part of this ongoing experimentation. They may fail. There's no guarantee that they will win. They may be replaced by something else. But people in the Muslim world, just like here, are trying to answer the same questions of how can we become more in charge of our own destiny in a world that is controlled by others, including others. I don't mean foreign powers. Others, I mean our governments as well.
I think that takes us right to the end of our time, so please join me in thanking the panelists.